Welcome to this, the week 20 or week 10 of this term, last week of term. Good to see you all. And this week we're going to hear from Professor Vernon Bogdanor, previously of Oxford, now at King's College. And this week we're going to hear about general elections in Britain. You don't need me to tell you that we are now, I forget how many days, I think it's now 50. Somebody somewhere will have a whiteboard, I'm no doubt, with these numbers written on days before the general election. And it seemed to me appropriate for the last lecture of this course this year that it would be good to hear about past general elections, past governments, and the implications that these have for the coming general election. So a bit of history and a bit of an understanding based on those past elections and governments about what's about to happen and when we hear these results this time, what we can sort of infer from the past about it. Anyway, Professor Vernon Bogdanor.
Well, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you would excuse me if I take swigs of tea during the lecture. I'm a bit dry from earlier speaking experiences this afternoon. Now, I think this general election is fascinating, and I imagine that most people here are students either of the social sciences or of history, and I think this election poses a challenge to both disciplines. Social scientists claim that they can produce models which can forecast and predict election results, and I was at such a conference around 3 weeks ago run by the Political Studies Association, and four social scientists separately presented models based on past elections, past precedents, mathematical models which could forecast the result. And two forecast that the Conservatives would have the largest number of seats, and two forecast that Labour would have the largest number of seats. And the chairman summed up very fairly, I think. He said, my prediction is that this is an election which is impossible to predict, though I'm not totally confident about my prediction. I think I'm not going to talk quite so much about history as perhaps Tony would like, because I think there is no historical precedent for this election. It is something totally new, and I think history is no guide, because we've never before had a situation in England where there are five parties with over 5% of the vote, five parties in contention, not all of them in contention for government, but all could have some impact on the result. Even a party which doesn't win many seats, which is probably likely to happen with the Greens and with UKIP, they could affect the result in marginal seats by taking more votes from one party than from another. For example, UKIP could deny the Conservatives victory in some seats, and the Greens could deny Labour a victory in some seats. So even a party which doesn't get many seats can affect the result very seriously. In the last election, UKIP won no seats, but it won 3% of the vote. And in 20 of the seats that UKIP fought, their vote was larger than the Labour or Liberal Democrat majority. And that means that if you were to assume that every UKIP voter voted Conservative, which is not wholly unrealistic, the Conservatives would have had an overall majority in Parliament. Another result of interest is that Ed Balls wouldn't be in Parliament because his majority was less than the UKIP vote in Morley and Outwood. And in one seat, it had a rather perverse result. In Wells, in Somerset, a Conservative Eurosceptic, who on the whole agreed with UKIP, a man called David Heathcote Amory, had an agreement with Nigel Farage that UKIP wouldn't put up a candidate against him. But the local party didn't like that and said, we insist on fighting the seat. And the outcome was to hand the seat over to the Liberal Democrats, who won it. And the effect of UKIP intervention under our strange electoral system was to hand the balance of power to the Liberal Democrats in Parliament, who are, of course, the most pro-European party in British politics. So quite a perverse result. Now, we've got a five-party system in England. In Scotland and Wales, of course, you have a six-party system because you have the nationalists as well. And all that is a great contrast to the past. If you go back 60 years to the election of 1955, there were just 9 MPs in Parliament who didn't belong to the Conservative and Labour parties. 6 of them were Liberals and 3 from Northern Ireland. In the last election, there were 85, of whom 57 were Liberal Democrats, so it's a great change. Now, furthermore, we used to think of elections, we certainly did in the 1950s, as involving a national swing, that a party which would do well, shall we say, in Cornwall would also do well in Scotland. And in 1955, the Conservatives won a comfortable overall majority, and that majority included a majority of seats in Scotland and also a majority of votes in Scotland, the only time any party has ever won a majority of votes in Scotland since the war. So you had a broadly national swing, and voting behaviour was, broadly speaking, based upon class. And if you belonged to a certain class in Brighton, you'd vote the same way as someone who belonged to that class in Edinburgh. Now, that had probably disappeared in part, and we face a number of regional battles of a different sort. Obviously, if you live in Scotland, the battle seems to be between the Scottish nationalists and Labour. The Conservatives had just one seat in Scotland, and the Liberals 11. Liberal Democrats thought they would lose some of those, and the basic choice between the Scottish nationalists and Labour. If you live in the southwest of England, the choice is broadly between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. Labour tend to be the third party in most constituencies there. If you live in London or the Midlands, it's broadly Labour versus the Conservatives. The Liberals are not very strong, either in London historically or in the Midlands historically. If you live in an East Coast decaying seaside resort, and I'll say more about that later, Clacton or something like that, the battle is really between the Conservatives and UKIP. It's interesting that both the two UKIP seats, Rochester and Clacton, were both fairly recently Labour seats. Clacton was the old Harwich and was a Labour seat until, I think, 2005, and Rochester was won by the Conservatives from Labour in 2010, but Labour in the recent by-elections was nowhere in contention in those seats. So you've got different battles in different parts of the country, and the probability is, it's not certain, but the probability is that we won't see a national swing, but different sorts of regional swings throughout the country. Now, you can see that there wasn't a national swing from the last election. That in 2010, the Labour Party lost just over 6% of its 2005 vote, but the Conservatives won under 4% of that, and the rest of it went to other parties. So there'll probably be gains and losses to and from minor parties as well as the major parties, so you can't really predict the outcome. You can perhaps predict something of the direction of change. I think it's reasonable to predict that UKIP and the Greens, whatever their vote, will get very few seats under our electoral system, that the only minor party likely to gain a lot of votes would be the Scottish nationalists. And one result of all these changes is that our system, I think, is much less centripetal than it was in the 1950s. In the 1950s, the Conservative and Labour parties were fighting to win over the floating voter who was in the middle ground. And therefore, it was thought if you were on the far left or the far right, you might be a bit of a disadvantage to your party. But now the Conservatives seem to be much more worried about UKIP than they are about the centre vote. They've moved to the right, if you call it like that, on issues like immigration and Europe. They're very concerned that they don't lose votes to UKIP. And Labour Party beginning to get concerned it doesn't lose votes to the Greens on the left, or in Scotland, the SNP, who are really to the left of Labour. So perhaps the system is becoming a little more centrifugal than it was. So I think that is another very interesting change. And the prediction, the most of the prediction, is that there will be a hung parliament. Now, I think we need to distinguish between the hung parliament we had in 2010 and the hung parliament we might get this time. Because the hung parliament in 2010 resulted in a coalition government with a comfortable majority in Parliament of 78. And whether you're in favour of that government or against it, I think you'd have to admit it provided stable government for 5 years. It was never in serious danger of being defeated, having to go to the country. And it acted in many ways a bit like a single-party government. Now, let's suppose, as is quite possible, that we get a different sort of hung parliament, the sort we had in February 1974. And in that hung parliament, no two parties acting together, except for Labour and the Conservatives in a grand coalition, which I think is unlikely, no two parties acting together could secure a majority. Now, that could happen this time. It depends probably mainly on how many seats the Liberal Democrats lose. It's generally thought they'll lose some seats. But let's suppose the total of Conservative and Liberal Democrat seats, or Labour and Liberal Democrat seats, does not equal 325, which is the number you need for a majority. Then you won't be able to form a majority government at all, because the SNP, which is likely to win a large number of seats, will not join in coalition with any other party, and Labour said they won't join in coalition with them, and UKIP and the Greens are not likely to win a large number of seats. So there's a possibility of a fragmented hung parliament. Now, the last fragmented hung parliament we had after the February 1974 election, the minority government led by Harold Wilson for the Labour Party, that lasted just 7 months, and then Wilson dissolved and gained a small majority. Now, it's not so easy to do that now because of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, and that says you can only have an early dissolution if one of two conditions are met. The first is you need a two-thirds majority in the House of Commons. The second is that after a vote of no confidence in a government, no alternative government can be formed within 14 days. Now, let's assume that Ed Miliband forms a minority Labour government. He could try and get round this by putting forward a motion in Parliament calling for an election and challenging the opposition not to support it. If they don't support it, they look as if they're cowards, they're frightened of an election. But presumably Ed Miliband would put down this motion when he thought Labour could win an overall majority, and then by definition the Conservative opposition could not win, so they might well oppose it. And then Miliband could, it's a risk, he could resign and challenge anyone else to form a government. That is possible. But it's fair to say it's more difficult now to have a second election than it would have been was in 1974. And furthermore, if, as I'll try and show later, this growth of multi-party politics is not an accident, but reflects something important happening in British society, then a second election might not lead to a different result from the one we've had, or a very different result. And the one in October gave Labour a very small overall majority of 3, which was lost after about 18 months. But it may be, if we're in permanently multi-party situation, we may have lost the chance of getting national and overall majorities. But I think this is one thing that we know about the election, roughly the sort of strength the smaller parties are likely to get. Another thing we know is that the electoral system is very biased against the Conservatives. If I give you two figures, in the 2010 election, the Conservatives gained roughly 36% of the vote, and the Labour Party gained 29% of the votes, a gap of 7%. And as you know, that led to a hung parliament. Now, if you look at the election before that, in 2005, the Labour Party gained 36% of the vote, and the Conservatives 33% of the votes, a gap of 3%. But that led to a comfortable Labour overall majority of over 60. So you can see the great difference. And it's been calculated, if the two parties got the same vote in 2010, then Labour would have had 55 more seats than the Conservatives. Now, that is partly due to the boundaries, that the boundaries are inequitable, and they haven't been properly revised for nearly 15 years. And there was a squabble in the coalition about revising them, but they haven't been revised. And given that the movements of population are, broadly speaking, from the inner cities, which tend to be Labour, to the suburbs, the rural areas, which tend to be Conservative, this damages the Conservative Party. But that's not the only reason, and Conservatives often say it is, because they're so attached to the first-past-the-post system. But the truth is, even if the boundaries were absolutely equal, there'd still be a bias against the Conservatives, because their vote is inefficiently distributed. They pile up too many votes in safe seats, whereas a Labour vote is better distributed. And under our electoral system, which I'm opposed to, let me say, but under our electoral system, how many seats you win depends not only on how many votes you get, but upon where those votes are distributed geographically. And if your vote is very concentrated, you're going to win more seats than a party whose vote is even across the country. In the extreme example, which will never happen, of course, in the extreme example, you could get 49% of the vote in every constituency and not get a single seat. I mean, that obviously wouldn't happen, but you can see the point, I'm sure. So I think the Conservatives have a great difficulty there of securing an overall majority with that. And obviously, as I say, a hung parliament is a very likely outcome. Now, for a coalition to be secured after the hung parliament, there will be changes from 2010, because the Conservative backbenchers have demanded that they have a vote on this, which they didn't have in 2010. And some of them take the view they were sold it under a false prospectus. The first is that Britain faced so serious an economic position that they could be in the condition of Greece if you didn't produce a stable majority government quickly. And the second was that they had to agree to a referendum on the alternative vote because the Labour Party was proposing to offer it without a referendum, which I think is probably not the case, and I don't know whether people believed it or not. But anyway, the Conservatives now demand a vote on the coalition. And the Liberal Democrats have a complicated procedure, as you could probably guess, for deciding on whether they should have a coalition, which requires a vote from the MPs, a vote from the peers, and a vote from their federal executive, which represents the members. And there are also further complications, which I'll gladly go into if you question me about it, but perhaps won't for the time being. But, I mean, the problem for the Liberal Democrats is this, even if they do win enough seats, that in two-thirds of their seats, the Conservatives are the main challengers. So if they lose seats, it'll be mainly for the Conservatives. Now, would they then wish to go into coalition with a party which has defeated them in so many seats? Secondly, it's probable that Nick Clegg will resign as leader, and that a leader who succeeds him will be more to the left than Nick Clegg and will say that we've lost seats because we joined a coalition with the Conservatives. This was a mistake. Perhaps we shouldn't do it again. It's not clear, but I think it will be more difficult. And I think it would be very difficult for the Labour Party to agree a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I think it would split the Labour Party very seriously indeed. So I think that is not possible. I think what is possible are local pacts between the Conservatives and UKIP, because there are some Conservatives who agree with UKIP policy but don't join UKIP, and they may say, we will vote to take Britain out of the European Union. Please don't put up a candidate against us and split the vote. That may happen. And it may be the Conservatives are divided on European matters. Of course, it's happened before. There's a lot of talk about instability in the election. A hung parliament could lead to instability. I personally think the most unstable result will be a small Conservative majority, because that'll be like John Major's government in the 1990s, which had a majority of 21, and older people here will remember the problems John Major had, particularly on European issues, on things like Maastricht, ratifying the treaty, because with a majority of 21, any 11 backbenchers could derail the government. And John Major used to say that of his majority of 21, 13 MPs were completely mad. And if Cameron had a majority, shall we say, of 20, which I think is probably larger than he would get, it would mean any 11, if you like, extreme right-wingers could derail him on any issue. And I suspect Cameron would prefer to be dependent on Liberal Democrats in the centre than on Peter Bone and Nadine Dorries and similar people. So I think that, oddly enough, would be the most unstable result, a government with a small overall majority. Now, I've said that I think this movement to multi-party politics is not an accident, but relates to something very fundamental. And I think the reason is this, that both UKIP in England and the Scottish Nationalists in Scotland appeal to a social grouping which is neglected by the existing parties, namely those who have been left behind by social and economic change and left behind by the pressures of globalisation. And people used to think that the typical UKIP voter was a sort of retired colonel disgusted of Tunbridge Wells, as it were, complaining in his golf club about the way the world is going to the dogs. But that isn't the typical UKIP voter. The typical UKIP voter, it's been said, and this is a crude summary, has a white skin, a blue collar and grey hair. And the excellent book, one of the best books I've read on British politics for many years, by Robert Ford and Matthew Goodwin, called Revolt on the Right, shows it's the left behind who are voting for UKIP. And the main indicator of a UKIP vote is lack of higher education. Now, at meetings like this, there's always someone who gets up and says, well, I've been to university and I've got 2 degrees and I vote for UKIP. But of course, this is a statistical figure. It doesn't mean everyone who votes UKIP is like that. But the main indicator of a UKIP vote would be lack of higher education. So this is a cleavage, call it the meritocratic cleavage, if you like, between, I think, all of us in this room who belong to what you might call the exam-passing classes, or those who hope to join the exam-passing classes, and those who are not members of that class. And those who are not members of that class tend to feel much more strongly, not only about the European Union, but more important about immigration and about gay marriage than people in this who do belong to that class. And that class is both socially and geographically immobile, unlike us. Now, we who go to university, we are socially mobile, we move to get better jobs and so on, and we tend to be geographically mobile. If we come from Clacton, 60 years ago, we might have stayed in Clacton, we might have become solicitors or local business people, members of the council and so on. Now we won't. We'll go to an elite university, the LSE, King's, Oxford, Cambridge, wherever, and we'll work in London as barristers or academics or lawyers or whatever, business, finance people and so on. We'll leave Clacton behind. And so you have decaying market towns. Clacton has a very large proportion of people without higher education, older people who are left behind by social and economic change. It's very significant. In the European elections last spring, London was the only part of England where UKIP did not come first or second in the European elections. It's where the elite tend to congregate. And the elite is on the whole pro-European Union. The elite is on the whole sympathetic to immigration. The elite is almost 100% sympathetic to gay marriage. There are a lot of people who aren't. And David Cameron moved the Conservative Party, or tried to move the Conservative away from the image of being the nasty party towards being a socially liberal party. And Tony Blair moved the Labour Party away from its traditional moorings towards New Labour to catch the aspirationals and professional middle-class people who previously hadn't been voting for the Labour Party. And that left a gap. And UKIP is now the most working-class party in Britain. Now, in Scotland, slightly different class structure, but there, if you look at the result of the referendum in September, last September, it was a class vote. That Labour voters in the west central belt of Scotland, where most Scottish voters live, they voted yes. But SNP voters in the middle-class areas of Perthshire and Aberdeenshire voted no. And middle-class SNP voters are getting rather worried about what an independent Scotland might be like. They think it might be a little left-wing, too left-wing for them, and there's a reaction against the SNP in those areas. If you compare two areas very close together in Scotland, West Dunbartonshire and East Dunbartonshire, West Dunbartonshire, which has one of the lowest life expectancy rates in Scotland, and some rates in Scotland are very low, parts of Glasgow are lower than the Gaza Strip. West Dunbartonshire voted yes. East Dunbartonshire, which is the kind of Hampstead of Glasgow, voted no. And that's a very clear class division. And the SNP are doing to the Labour Party in Scotland what Nigel Farage is doing to the Conservatives in England. And it's for this social reason that I think the multi-partyism is here to stay, that these new parties represent an important social cleavage. The Greens represent a quite different one, but I think they too will be permanent. Now, the election is not only, or perhaps not even primarily, about the socioeconomic issues which we're used to considering. Certainly not about whether you favour more nationalisation or more private enterprise. That's a closed and settled issue. To some extent it's about taxation, but minimally we're talking about whether the top rate of income tax should be 45% or 50%. No one's proposing it should go back to over 80%, which it was in the 1980s. That's another closed and settled question. And Margaret Thatcher, for good or ill, did settle a number of questions. The way before him, Attlee, had settled a number of questions. I mean, Attlee settled the question of the health service and basic minimum standards of social welfare. No one who wants to get elected proposes radical alterations to the health service. Certainly no one now who wants to get elected is proposing an 80% tax rate or large-scale nationalisation. And broadly speaking, both political parties accept the economic framework. The Labour Party is, contrary to what many of its supporters think, is proposing a degree of austerity, but rather less than the Conservatives. The Labour Party is proposing until 2018 real cuts of roughly 2% a year, the Conservative real cuts of 8% a year. And this, the main problem for the Labour Party is not, I think, as many Conservatives would say, that it's going to go on a wild spending spree, but the discrepancy between the rectitude of the Labour leadership and the hopes and expectations of its supporters and many of its MPs, who will ally themselves with the Scottish nationalists, the Welsh nationalists and the Greens in a kind of left-wing anti-austerity bloc. Some people here may have heard Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP leader yesterday, who said she was strongly against austerity and would try and work to combat that. And she said that people in England should vote either for the Greens or what she called a progressive Labour candidate, in other words, someone who was against austerity. And that is likely to cause very serious problems, I think, for a Labour government. And so its main problem won't be red ed, or it'll be the tool of the trade unions, or involved in a wild spending spree. The problem will be the discrepancy between what people voting Labour hope to achieve, which is rapid improvements in the public services, and the reality of Labour's policies, which may be right, they may be wrong, but they're not policies of expenditure. The left wing of the Labour Party, or progressive wing, whatever you call it, would want that. The SNP want that. Plaid Cymru, the Greens want that, but not the Labour leadership. So it's not these, but these socioeconomic issues are not, I think, the main or even the only element in the election. The election, much more than previous ones, is about problems of identity, and I think problems of ideology are coming to be replaced in many Western democracies by questions of identity, questions about what it means to be British. Can you be both British and European? Can you be both Scottish and British? How can Englishness be expressed within the United Kingdom, within the British framework? And these questions of identity, I think, are felt most strongly, again, by people with little to lose, people who've been left behind, people who have not much else. The elite, I think, are less concerned about those questions than the left behind. And of course, one of the key issues in the election will be the question of Europe, which is the sort of poisoned chalice for British politicians, and the question of whether Britain will remain in Europe. As you know, the Conservatives are proposing a referendum on whether we should remain or not, and UKIP are proposing, the Conservatives are proposing this after a renegotiation or a new settlement, but UKIP are proposing a referendum and advocating immediate exit from Europe. Now, David Cameron was originally against a referendum on Europe. There was a debate on Europe in October 2011 as a result, the first result of the popular petition system. Westminster agreed that if over 100,000 people signed a petition, it would get a debate. And there have been only two so far, first on Europe, second on immigration. And on that debate on Europe, David Cameron issued a 3-line whip against a referendum, but 81 MPs ignored that whip and voted for one. Now, in January 2013, David Cameron agreed to a referendum. He made a speech, a Bloomberg speech, in 2013, in January, which I think few people have read, because in that speech he did not mention the word renegotiation, and he did not mention the word immigration. He spoke of a new general settlement in Europe, which, and I quote, he could enthusiastically recommend to the British people. It was one of the most pro-European speeches of any British Prime Minister for many years. And the new general settlement comprised things which I think we could all agree with. He said Europe needed greater accountability and democracy. Couldn't argue with that, I think. It needed greater subsidiarity and more devolution downwards. Again, I don't think anyone would argue with that. He said it needed protection. The non-Eurozone member states needed protection, constitutional protection against the Eurozone. Again, it's difficult to argue with that, really. And there should be greater involvement by national parliaments. Again, it's really motherhood and apple pie. We can all agree with that. But more recently, he's made a speech on immigration. He said the key issue is the free movement of peoples in Europe. And he said that will require treaty change. Now, treaty change, I think, is very unlikely because, as you know, it requires unanimous agreement by 27 other member states. And I think that's unlikely to be achieved. Even if done without treaty change, I think it would be difficult to achieve. You would need, I think, a qualified majority on the Council, agreement of the Commission and the European Parliament. That, too, is unlikely. But even if Cameron got everything he wanted, I think it would make a very marginal difference because the vast majority of immigrants from the EU do not come for benefits but for jobs, or perhaps they already have work. So the danger is he's raising expectations that cannot be met. And it's clear he's being pushed, and by the UKIP threat, if you like. It's a centrifugal push to the right, if you call it that, on that issue. But even the fact that he's moved so far, he's still to the left, if one looks like that, of the majority of Conservatives, because those who don't support the UKIP position want to see repatriation of social and employment powers from the European Union. And that would make the European Union, in effect, a free trade area, which it never was and never could be. So there are very serious problems for the Conservatives on Europe, I think, of raising expectations that can't be met. And if you like, repeating Harold Wilson's trick of 1975 of doing a cosmetic renegotiation and then saying he's got fundamental changes and people then supported it. I think the situation is very different now because then there was much more trust for political leaders. And Roy Jenkins was asked why in 1975 he thought there was such a large yes vote. And he replied rather patronisingly, he said, people took the advice of those they were used to taking advice from. But I think now people don't take advice from their political leaders. It's a less deferential political culture. So I think the question of whether we remain in Europe is very much open. And I think the interesting question, to which there's no answer, is whether a Labour government would be pushed into having a referendum itself. I mean, Miliband is obstinate against it, but are the popular pressures too strong? David Cameron said in his Bloomberg speech that he thought consent for the European Union in Britain was wafer thin and needed to be legitimised by a referendum. And so after the 1975 referendum, one of Harold Wilson's advisers said that Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister, had taken the British establishment into Europe, but it needed Harold Wilson to take the British people into Europe. Now I think a lot of the British people are out of Europe. The establishment remains in. The financial, business and political establishment remain in Europe. They're strong supporters of it. But a lot of the people are not. And, of course, immigration is fuelling anti-European sentiment. So that, I think, is a problem for the election. And obviously the question of now whether we remain in Europe is, in a sense, out of the hands of the British government. It depends on the other member states whether we get a successful renegotiation, if you want to call it that, and depends on the British people whether that renegotiation is acceptable. Now, my final point, which is on Scotland, is this, that there's a lot of talk about the Scottish nationalists playing a part in government, and it seems to be wrong if you're a unionist. It seems a rather odd position to say, we welcome Scotland in the United Kingdom, but if they vote for the Scottish nationalists, they're a pariah party and not allowed to play any role at Westminster. You can't have it both ways. Either they are part of the country or they're not. But the problem, of course, is if you have a government of the left, a Labour government, Labour supported by the SNP, it will almost certainly not have a majority in England. And the English will complain, I'm sure, that they will say, well, why are the Scots playing a part in deciding health and education for England when we can't do that for Scotland because of the Scottish Parliament makes those decisions? The Scots' tail is wagging the dog. If we have a government of the right, it almost certainly won't have a majority in Scotland, as the present government doesn't. The Conservatives have 1 seat out of 59 in Scotland, the Liberals 11. So either way, the election will exacerbate the English-Scottish question. And therefore, I think it's reasonable to conclude, as one sociologist has concluded, John Curtis, he said this is a lottery election. And I think one outcome of the election will be that the question of the electoral system will come back onto the political agenda. I think that UKIP, which could win, shall we say, 10% of the vote and hardly any seats, I think UKIP supporters will growl very loudly, and growl more loudly than Liberal Democrats used to growl, or a mild-mannered lot. UKIP, I think, are less mild-mannered. They'll complain very loudly. And Nigel Farage, perhaps paradoxically, favours the German system of proportional representation. And, of course, the Greens are also in favour of PR, so are the Scottish nationalists, and, of course, the Liberal Democrats, and some in the Labour Party, too. So I think that issue will come to the fore. And I think the electoral system, as well as denying representation to small parties, is also exacerbating the England-Scotland problem. I said a few moments ago the Conservatives have 1 seat out of 59 in Scotland. This doesn't mean no one votes Conservative in Scotland. In the last election, the Conservatives gained 17% of the vote in Scotland, 1 in 6. Only 3% behind the SNP vote. But the way the electoral system works means they don't get any seats. And Labour was grossly overrepresented with 41 seats. On a PR system, the Conservatives would have 10 and Labour 24. So although there is a difference between Scotland and England, there's a discrepancy. It's not as great as the electoral system would show. Now, if you look at the great cities of the Midlands of the North, if you look at Birmingham, Manchester, Hull, Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle, would anyone like to guess how many seats the Conservatives won in those cities in 2010? Well, Dick, you know, but the others don't. The Conservatives won no seats in those cities, despite nearly winning the election. And again, that doesn't mean no one votes Conservative there. It means they're not represented. And similarly, if you draw a line from the Severn to the Wash, south of that line outside London, there are 197 seats and Labour won just 10. Again, it doesn't mean that no one voted Labour. It means that the Labour minority is not represented. So the electoral system discriminates not only against minor parties, but against the second party in areas where it is not particularly strong. And the way it works, it makes the south and the north look more hostile and polarised than they are, and it makes England and Scotland look more polarised than in fact it is. And in my personal view, the electoral system is a threat now to the unity of the country. So I think this is a lottery election, and anyone who predicts the election, I think, needs their heads, wants to predict the result, needs their heads examined. I'm certainly not going to do so. It's a fascinating election. But I think one prediction I would make is that the electoral system will come back to haunt us after the general election is over. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'm sure there will be a number of questions, but if I can just get us going, and this is something we were talking about just before we arrived here. You made the point that the coalition that was formed in 2010 was unusual, not only in that it was a coalition, but that also the previous coalitions that had been formed in either pre-formed or wartime, yes. And it could just unravel that.
You've reminded me of a very good point I made earlier.
You did. It was a very good point. Make it again more publicly.
Yes. Now, the 2010 hung Parliament led to a coalition. Now, that's the first time in 20th century Britain that a hung Parliament has led to a coalition. In the past, they've normally led to minority governments, 1924, 29, 74. The coalitions we've had have resulted from emergency situations, wartime in the First and Second World Wars, and 1931, the economic crisis, not from hung parliaments themselves. Now, in each of these elections, in 1918, 1931, the coalition went to the country as a coalition. It was formed before the election and went to the country to seek validation. So you could either vote for the coalition or the opposition if you didn't like the coalition. Now here, the coalition was formed after the election. No one could have voted for it one way or the other, no single voter. And the coalition produced a coalition agreement. It's agreement on policies, but unlike an election manifesto, it wasn't before any voter. And this did lead to odd results. The Guardian, on the day of the last election, recommended its readers to vote Liberal Democrat to create a progressive coalition with Labour. And I think anyone who did that would be rather annoyed at the outcome effect of their vote. And there is a Dutch saying where coalitions are frequent that you can win the election but lose the formation afterwards. And everybody talks as if the formation of that coalition was inevitable. But it did depend in part at least, I think, on the chemistry between the leaders. If Ming Campbell had still been the Liberal Democrat leader or Charles Kennedy, I think you wouldn't have had that coalition. I think if David Davis had been the Conservative leader, you wouldn't have had it. I think if David Miliband had been the Labour leader, you might not have had it. It all depends on contingent factors. And it seems to me the voters are entitled to know before the election whom you will consider forming a coalition with and what items in your policy are bargainable or not. And obviously many students feel annoyed about the Liberal Democrat pledge on student fees, which they now say we didn't really intend to be taken seriously, and we tried to argue against it privately and didn't really matter anyway, be realistic, grow up. But after all, there was a pledge, it was in the manifesto. And I think this does cause problems for democracy because it creates a gap between democracy and the principle of parliamentary government. Normally they're the same. You're voting for a party which has a majority and the Prime Minister leader of that party. But in a hung parliament, they're two separate stages, and the danger is the voter can be left out of it. And this is the great danger we don't avoid in some continental countries. It's not a necessary consequence of PR, but it can be. And I think, frankly, the voters were shortchanged. The coalition seems to me an anti-democratic, the way it was formed, not to meet the canons of democracy. I think students, obviously, many students pretty annoyed. Young people, there was an increase in the percentage of young people voting. There's still not many of them, but 18 to 24-year-olds went up from 37% in 2005 to 44%. I think partly because of the Liberal Democrat pledge, and so I think a lot of young people feel upset. It's still the case that the votes of the elderly are worth twice as much as the votes of the young, because there are twice as many of them, they're twice as likely to vote. So do get ready. If you haven't registered, do get registered and vote, particularly if you're young, because it's the young who don't register and don't vote. So, and this is why it's so easy to protect pensions, but students get kicked with student fees and so on because they don't vote.
One other thing that I think is inevitably discussed as we head into a general election with an uncertain result, and that's the role, and I should have said in introducing him, two or three things I should have said. One, of course, Vernon is one of Britain's leading constitutional expert.
It's easy to be in a country without a constitution.
Vernon's Britain's leading unwritten constitution expert. But he's written, if even the constitution isn't. The role of the head of state, the role of the monarch. Now, after all, the way governments are formed in the United Kingdom, formally, if we go back to the lecture we had on, the Constitution or the unwritten Constitution weeks ago, I mean, the Queen, I think I'm right in saying, invites the Prime Minister to form the government. Now, how is the Queen to act in all of this, or does the Queen act at all?
Good question. There's a great contrast between the role of the monarch in this election, last election, and the role of the monarch in 1931 when the national government was formed. And when Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the minority Labour government, said he was going to resign, the King said, well, your government can resign, but I hope there's no question of you resigning. And he invited him to meet with the other two party leaders in Buckingham Palace and more or less lock them into a room until they'd agreed to form a national government. And the story, I've not heard it confirmed anywhere, but it's sort of informal gossip, is that the King actually said to MacDonald, you've got us into this bloody mess, now get us out of it. Now, the role of the Queen was quite different in 2010, that she symbolically remained at Windsor for 5 days while the negotiations were going on, so she played no part. And since the 1963, since the controversial selection of Alec Douglas-Home as successor to Macmillan as Prime Minister, the monarchy has taken the view it's not for them to play any active part in politics, it's for the political leaders to sort things out, and once they've sorted it out, the monarch will endorse their choice. And, for example, in the hung Parliament of February 1974, the politicians worked it out and the Queen then endorsed it. And similarly here, she's waiting at Windsor, the politicians negotiate and discuss, and when they've come up with an answer, they tell her and she endorses the outcome. And similarly now with the dissolution, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act takes away all of her discretion. There's rules about dissolution. And this is important, I think, because I think the monarchy now take the view that their role is to be not just head of the state, but head of the nation. And if you're to be head of the nation, you can't take a discretionary decision which could be controversial. And if you choose a Labour Prime Minister or Conservative Prime Minister or whatever, and that therefore these prerogative powers, as they're called, should be taken out of their hands. They don't want to keep them because they want to be symbolic heads of the nation as a whole and not involved in controversial political choice. I think there's a great change in the role of the monarchy, constitutionalising it, if you like. And so it's up to the politicians to sort things out. And it's only in highly unusual emergency situations the monarch would intervene, I think. But the politicians decide what they do. It may take longer this time, maybe longer than 5 days. And the continent sometimes takes a long time. I think Belgium was 6 months without a government at one time. I'm not saying it'll happen here, but it takes a long time. And contrary to what some people have been saying, the largest party doesn't have the first option after a hung Parliament election. The Prime Minister, the incumbent, has the first option of what to do. And until 1868, the Prime Minister always met Parliament after an election. But in 1868, Disraeli, who was defeated by Gladstone, thought, what's the point? I'm bound to be defeated on the Queen's speech. I might as well save time and avoid humiliation by going now. And that's normally what Prime Ministers do if they're defeated. John Major in 1997 went immediately. But in a hung Parliament, you're entitled to stay until defeated on the Queen's speech, which is, in effect, a vote of confidence, which is the first substantive business before the new Parliament. And a Prime Minister in those circumstances, in a hung Parliament, he can either resign immediately, you could do that if you wanted, you could try and form either a coalition or confidence supply agreement, or even without that, you can meet Parliament as a minority and challenge them to vote you down in the Queen's speech. In a sense, the Constitution doesn't recognise the election, it recognises only the parliamentary system. So the fact that someone's got more votes or more seats is irrelevant. The Queen's speech is the test. You put a programme forward and see what happens.
And you mentioned and that's my third and final question, you mentioned the 1860s. As we move forward into a world where blocks of votes are not big enough, possibly, I mean, as a colleague said the other day, everybody's going to be, all the people studying elections are going to be very disappointed if one party just gets a majority at this general election after we've all talked about it for weeks and weeks about all these things that might happen. But if we, as it appears, after you say yourself, after over 50 years of the decline in the Conservative plus Labour vote, and we're moving forward to a point where perhaps no one, possibly not two, conceivably not even three parties could form a government, but would have to have some minority in a loose agreement. That begins to sound to me a bit like the world, or elements of the world, backwards of the 1860s. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. And it cast doubt on majority rule. I mean, I mentioned in my talk Labour government elected with an overall majority in 2005 on 36% of the vote. Now, is that majority rule when nearly two-thirds of the voters have voted against it? Is that, what do you think of that? I mean, it's likely that neither of the parties will get 2/5 of the vote in this election. 40%. The last party to get 40% of the vote was Labour in 2001. And as I said, a Conservative government with an overall majority, probably under 40% of the vote, would be highly unstable, at the mercy of its right wing. A Labour government, very unlikely, I think, a Labour government with an overall majority, probably under 40% of the vote, that'll be in trouble imposing its economic policy against its left wing, its progressive wing, if you like. It'll be very, very difficult indeed. So I think an overall majority for either party would be more unstable this time than a hung parliament, actually.
Right. OK, right, now, some questions, 2, 3. So let's take 1, 2, well, can we go 1, 2, 3? Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. As you've touched on this briefly, there's been a lot of talk by party leaders about whether or not they would form a coalition in recent days, and there's been a lot of speculation in the media and so on. Given that any party who wants to be in some kind of majority government will probably have to form a coalition after the general election, do you think it's wise that the party leaders be doing this? Do you think the decision will come back to haunt them?
Well, the main thing they've said is that the Labour Party won't form a coalition with the SNP. The Conservatives said they won't form a coalition with UKIP, but that wasn't on. No one suggested it, I think. UKIP wouldn't join a coalition with the Conservatives, except on the condition that an immediate referendum taking us out of Europe, which the Conservatives couldn't agree to. And the SNP wouldn't join a coalition with any British party anyway. So I don't think anything's lost by saying that. The key issue is whether could be a confidence and supply agreement between Labour and the SNP.
Can you explain? I mean,
sure.
Just do a confidence and supply.
Well, confidence and supply, it's an ambiguous term, actually. We all know what confidence means, is that you won't vote against the government in a vote of confidence. But what does supply mean? Does it mean you'd be consulted on the budget? Well, you'd have to consult on the budget if you were a minority party. That's no concession. Does it mean you'd have a veto on the budget? Surely not. What does it mean? It's not a clear term. But it does mean you wouldn't let the government be defeated. And in my personal view, the SNP cannot do anything, cannot be seen to do anything, let me say, to undermine a Labour government. Now, it's in the SNP's interest to have a Conservative government, so that they can say Scotland's again got a government it didn't vote for, just as in UKIP's interest to have a Labour government, because the referendum could shoot their fox. But the SNP, there are strong memories in Scotland that in 1979 the SNP voted against Labour in a confidence vote, which Callaghan, the Labour Prime Minister, said was Turkeys voting for Christmas, because they were reduced from 11 seats to 2. But more important in Scottish eyes, it led to 18 years of Conservative government, and they won't be wanting to do that again, particularly not before the 2016 elections of the Scottish Parliament, when they're hoping to get another majority and perhaps press for a second referendum. So the SNP cannot be seen to do anything, in my view, to undermine a Labour government, whether there's an agreement or not. UKIP couldn't be seen, I think, to do anything to undermine the Conservative promise of a referendum, though, as I say, it would shoot their fox. The Liberal Democrats are in the middle, and I don't think anyone's ruled out a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, who are the most likely coalition partner. They can swing between left and right, as it were. One doesn't know what they will do.
You don't think that sorry, Vernon, to interrupt you, you don't think that their experience of being in one coalition might make them a bit wary about going into another one?
Well, this is what I thought. But on the other hand, you may say, if you're a party committed to proportional representation, how can you be opposed to coalition? Because proportional representation is bound to lead to more coalitions. So they're in a difficult position, but my hunch is they would move to the left. And there won't be another coalition, but it's a guess, really. I just think one can predict. And as I said, it may be that even with the Liberal Democrats, you can't get a majority of 325. In an odd way, the Liberal Democrats would have been stronger with a confidence and supply agreement because collective responsibilities meant they had to vote for things they don't agree with, like the health and social care bill. And there's other things. With a confidence and supply agreement, they could say, well, we'll keep you in office, but we won't vote for the health and social care bill. You'll have to drop that. And that might have been a stronger position for them. But I think it's unclear what will happen.
Okay, next bit.
You use the expression 36% or 40% of the vote. And I wonder how meaningful a concept the vote as a homogeneous entity is in those circumstances, because actually it's merely the arbitrary arithmetic outcome of the summation of 650 individual results in 650 unique constituencies, each of which has its own individual electoral dynamic. 2/3 or 3/4 of those constituencies are safe. They're not going to change hands. Therefore, there's no logical reason, if you're a supporter of a party other than the majority one there, for voting at all. So those parties' votes probably grossly understated, but they're still in that national total. And in the constituencies which may change hands, in most instances, there are only probably two parties in contention. There may be some where there's more than two, but the majority is two. But it's a different two, depending on which constituency you're talking. So again, people voting in those constituencies are going to be voting by reference to the probable outcome of their voting behaviour in the context of the particular constituency in. So all these national aggregations reported in the opinion polls in the media are a fairly meaningless proposition.
It's true that national aggregates mean less than they did, as I said.
You made the swing point.
In
fairness, you made the
national swing. You're absolutely right. And one point not often made about the polls is showing the SNP doing very well against Labour in Scotland. Now, the Labour vote is nevertheless roughly the same as it was before the SNP surge, and this must mean Labour's doing a bit disproportionately better in England, which people aren't noticing. But I think oddly enough, turnout is not that much lower in safe seats than in marginals. You may say on rational ground it should be, but it isn't. And your argument would be more powerful if voters knew as much as you did about politics. Most of them don't. I mean, the evidence is most voters are unaware of the tactical situation in their constituency. We are all abnormal in this room because we're interested in politics. 98% of the public are not. And one of the mistakes we sometimes tend to make is to assume that everyone's as interested as we are. Before the debates last time, 28% of the public did not know who Nick Clegg was. And there was a recent fracas, you've probably heard about all this, about Natalie Bennett and the Greens, that she did a bad television broadcast, it was said. Now, focus groups have been asking people of their reaction to this, and most of the members of these focus groups did not know who Natalie Bennett was, though one group said that the Bennetts were key people in Pride and Prejudice. That thing. And we overestimate, and most people are not interested. And sadly, for democratic theory, for liberal democratic theory, the swing voters, the people whose votes are undecided and who swing the election, are the least knowledgeable and interested amongst all voters. Broadly speaking, the more interested you are in politics, the more likely it is that you've decided your vote. And I hope I can say this without getting lynched, but there are more swing voters amongst women than amongst men. It's less informed women who decide the election more than men. There are more women who are undecided and uninterested in politics than there are men. A Worcester woman, it was said some years ago, the people who are interested in politics, like us, are not those who decide the election. And the people who are going to decide the election know little about politics. They decide on purely concrete issues like how much goods cost in the shops, whether they can get an appointment with their doctor, whether John is learning to read and write at school and that sort of thing. And we live in a world, we all by definition live in a world of our own because we're interested in politics. The vast majority of people are not.
Keith. Right. Keith, over there. Yeah. Yes.
Just a brief comment and a question. commenters also that the one party in the next parliament who will have had recent experience of minority government are the SNP between 2007 and 2011 when it was successful. And actually, paradoxically, by doing a deal with the Conservatives, whom they now refuse to support.
Oh, absolutely.
But anyway, the main point...
That's the important point.
The point I was going to raise is really about tactical voting, because the extent to which the election is lottery is shown by the latest batch of constituency polls produced by Lord Ashcroft earlier today, when he went back, in fact, to 8 Conlab marginals and found that they're in England, and found that 5 of them had actually increased the Labour lead, very notably in places like Chester. Yes. Itchen is a Lab Con marginal, they'll be right. But so, something, because he thought perhaps because of the tightening of the national poll, you'd see this reflected in constituency polls, but the opposite is happening.
Yes, there's a good point. There's a great gap growing between those areas dependent upon public sector services and those where the private sector services. In the public sector service, for example, in the northwest, the Labour vote seems to be increasing, but that's an area where Labour's already strong, because public sector workers are not particularly enamoured of this government. In the Midlands, more dependent on the private sector, it appears that the Conservatives are doing rather better than the north of England because employment has increased and so on. There's a great gap on age grounds between the young and the old. So the young vote less, but the old have done very well under this government, the young less so. There's also a great gap growing between whites and non-whites, which was shown in the London elections, the European elections last year, that one key motivator of a Labour vote was ethnicity, and 2/3 of non-white voters voted Labour, and 2/3 of white voters voted Conservative or UKIP. And one of the reasons that Labour is doing better in London is that more non-white voters are registering. In the past, their percentage of registration was low, and more of them are voting, and there are more of them. And that is making a big impact in London and helping the Labour Party very considerably. And one of the interesting points about the election, I think this relates to a general point, which I will make in a moment, but one of the interesting points about the election is why the Conservatives did so badly last time amongst non-white voters. Only 16% of non-white people voted Conservative, although many of them are in other ways Conservative, professional jobs, middle-class jobs, if you like, and religion is probably stronger amongst non-white voters, and traditionalist attitudes and attitudes towards education and so on. And the reason, put very crudely, from polls have shown, is that non-white voters think Conservatives don't like them much. It's a legacy of Enoch Powell, if you like, and it's a strong folk image, I think, amongst non-white voters, because although one can analyse the speeches of Enoch Powell in an academic way, on the ground it did result, I think, in a lot of prejudice and sometimes violence against non-white people in the school playground and on the street. And so it's a powerful folk memory, I think. Now, as a more general point, which your question tempts me to raise, which I should perhaps mention, the great puzzle that sociologists cannot answer is this, that in 2011, pessimism was very high amongst voters on economic futures. Now optimism is very high. And on the Mori poll, it's the largest rise from pessimism to optimism they've seen, from an omnishambles budget to current circumstances with the economic recovery. But the puzzle is the Conservative vote has remained almost entirely stagnant. Now, why is it? It's a voteless recovery. And the reason that, the best reason I've seen it is, there was an interesting article by Peter Kellner in a recent issue of Prospect, in which he said that, again, crudely the answer is that voters don't like the Conservatives very much. And he gave a list of statements about the Conservative Party for people to agree with or disagree with. And they were statements like this: the Conservatives are really only concerned about the well-off and affluent and not people like yourself. And over 60% agreed with that. And then there was one of the other statements, I can't remember all of them, one of them was, behind the Conservative leadership, there are rather a large number of bigoted and intolerant people. And again, over 60% agreed with that. Now, I hasten to say I'm not expressing a view on that myself. I'm saying this is what people think, and this is why the Conservatives are not doing well. And it's perhaps happened in previous elections that people don't like the Conservatives but think perhaps they can run the economy properly, so you should vote for them. Other people say the Labour Party got its heart in the right place but can't run anything properly, and people remember 2010 and there's a folk memory there. So you have to see which of those, if any, if either of those perceptions wins. But this is why the Conservatives haven't gained from, as you'd expect they might, from economic prosperity. And your question, particularly strong amongst ethnic minority voters, many of them doing well economically.
Yes, Tim. Can you just wait for a microphone to come? No, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dick Leonard. I'd like to ask you about the attitude of the Liberal Party to the question of the coalition. During the last election, Clegg made what was an extremely eccentric decision, which was to say that he would talk first, to whichever of the larger parties was stronger in the Parliament. Now, I spent 30 years as a correspondent in an EU country writing about the EU. And in the EU, virtually every country has a permanent position of a multi-party coalition. Like Sweden is an exception, but and there may be one or two others. No small party in any of these countries, to my knowledge, would have made such a statement. If they made any statement at all, they would say, we will try to work with the other party which is closest to us in terms of policy. And I think this was the big mistake that Clegg made. He looks as though he's taken again. He went through a very elaborate triple lock, which he referred to make sure party members agreed. And he didn't think of the views of people who voted Liberal Democrat. A majority of whom, a clear majority of whom, were more pro-Labour than Conservative. And I think the reason for the collapse in the Liberal vote very soon after the election wasn't just the question of students being upset by voting promise. It was that he was a left-of-centre party which switched over to supporting a right-wing party. And I think he looks as though he's making the same mistake this time. The Liberals may not hold the balance of power, but if he does talk to the Conservatives first, I think a lot of people who are Liberal voters will be very disappointed.
Yes, I mean, last time it was clear you didn't have to be a great expert to realise when he said he'd talk first to the largest party, that did actually almost certainly mean the Conservatives. It was clear what was going to happen. No, I agree with what you say. And the Liberal, I mean, what we know about the Liberal Democrat vote is its core vote is much lower than that of the other parties. And by core vote, I mean the vote you'd get in the worst possible circumstance if you had a donkey leading the party, as it were. I mean, you may say Labour's core vote, its rock-bottom vote, was in 1983 when he got 27% of the vote, and that it wouldn't, in any circumstance, get lower than that. The Conservatives' core vote, probably 1997, 2001, 31% of the vote, a bit higher. Now, the Liberal core vote is thought by most sociologists to be about 5 or 6%, even lower, the people who vote Lib Dem under any circumstances. And the rest of the vote is composed of different elements. There's first the radical vote, some of which has gone to Labour, but some of which has gone to the Greens. There's the environmentalist vote, most of which has gone to the Greens. But there's also a large element, and this has been shown in by-elections, of what you might call a plague on all houses vote, of people who voted Liberal Democrat because they weren't either the other party. The other two parties were rascals. You couldn't trust politicians. The system was awful, so you ought to vote for a party which is not part of it. And that vote is going to UKIP, which now has the same appeal. And in the recent Middleton and Hayward by-election, UKIP got more votes from the Liberal Democrats than from Labour. Interesting enough, most of the Conservative votes they get are from Conservatives who were Labour voters in 2005 but switched to the Conservatives in 2010 and are very unhappy with the Conservatives. And I think in the long term, the UKIP challenge is much greater to Labour than to the Conservatives. Not yet, but in the long term in the north of England.
Yeah, on here. No, sorry, the microphone is...
Thank you for your lecture. My question's on one of your books and the talk about the need for a popular sort of constitution. If we're going to have more coalitions in the future, and as you said, they're not ratified by the voters in advance, what does that mean for engagement with democracy if, in effect, the government's decided by? You sort of alluded to it, but decided.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think that ideally a coalition ought to go to the country before the election, but if it doesn't, I think the parties ought to be pressed much harder than they are as to what their basic positions are and what positions they're prepared to bargain with other parties, which parties they're prepared to bargain with, which coalitions they might or might not be prepared to enter, which agreements they might be prepared to enter. You're absolutely right about that. It's fair to say some proportional representation systems do allow the voter to signal which coalitions he or she would like to see formed. The Irish one does and the German one does through the first and second vote mechanism. Our system doesn't really. And I think it is a great danger, that, and I think a reform of the electoral system would do something towards that, and I think that greater use of referendums and other instruments of direct democracy would help that too.
You don't think, I mean, that because the people at the top of certainly the big older parties, which are still older and big, I mean, they still got 70% of the 65-70% of the vote, that you can see it in the discourse at the moment. They find it very hard to say anything other than we're in this election to win it outright. We're in it. So if you were to they would find it, even with PR, I suspect, quite difficult to pre-signal. If you were the Liberal Democrats, you're saying, well, we'll sign up with Labour, because you'd think if we do that, then we'll all be voted out and somebody else will win, because they don't want all of us in this coalition. So this is all, is it not a matter of reserving their position, certainly for the time being, so that the big parties, at least, can pretend we can win the general election? Even the Liberal Democrats, before they went into the coalition, were still always saying perhaps we will win this election.
Yeah. Now, this is a matter for the interviewers to press them on, but as a further answer to your question, I think the kind of open primary elections that the parties looked as if they were pioneering after the expenses scandal, for instance, in Totnes, the Conservatives had an open primary which anyone could vote for. You could then choose to vote for a Conservative, let's say, who might form an agreement with UKIP, or a Conservative who might form an agreement with the Liberal Democrats. And I think this would also weaken the hold of the party machines. And the Conservatives appeared to be moving to that at one time. Very significantly, the lady who was chosen was not a professional politician, I think a local doctor who was popular with the voters, and the voters didn't use it in a tactical way to... but voted sensibly, and I think that would be one way to give greater popular participation, wider choice to people.
Yeah, another question? Yes, have another go.
Thank you. I wonder if I could just ask you to explore the process of coalition formation a little further, because it seems to me it's a two-stage exercise. Firstly, there's the negotiations between the cabals of party grandees in what are at least figuratively slow-filled rooms. We saw that last time. But there's then the process of ratification. You've then got to get the buy-in of your wider party. Now, you described what the Liberals did, which was their triple lock, and they eventually took it to a conference of their membership at large. In the circumstances, it was a bit of a walkover, but there's no certainty that on another occasion the membership would be willing to be dragooned into support of whatever had been negotiated. It's much less clear what processes would come into play in the other parties that might find themselves in this situation. Last time, the Tories, even the backbenchers, that mean their acquiescence was largely assumed, but if you've got enough limousines and red boxes on offer, there are ways of dragooning your backbenchers. But certainly, the Tory party has no past tradition of mass party democracy, and in consulting its wider membership on that, it's far from clear what the Labour Party would do in that circumstance. The last coalition it went into in 1940, I think the National Executive was asked to give its agreement, but that was a rather interesting and atypical set of circumstances in which that coalition was formed. And certainly there are other parties that might be in play in this situation, which haven't got significant parliamentary presence or haven't had it in the past, where mass party democracy is much stronger and their members expect to have a much larger say in the decisions of what the leadership gets up to. Now, the constitutional textbooks are silent on this subject because it isn't a situation that's arisen. But the parties might find that merely doing deals at parliamentary level was no guarantee to that sticking if they couldn't get the wider body of supporters to fall in line.
Yes, it's a fair point. The Conservatives, as I said, that the backbenchers are going to be asked to approve a coalition if there's to be a future one. The Labour Party hasn't got specific machinery. Again, as you said, I think it would have to go further than the National Executive. The Conservatives have no provision for consulting their members. You're absolutely right. And no, I agree. This is a problem of consultation. I mean, I assume I have to confess, I assume this coalition would not last because Liberal Democrat members would not wear it for very long. But I missed the point. I don't know whether anyone has read that great classic of social science by Albert Hirschman, Exit, Voice and Loyalty. But there are means of protest. One is voice, but the other is exit. And instead of protesting, Liberal Democrats have exited. So I think you raise an interesting problem. It's not easy to get agreement, and it may be, if we get this regularly, the parties will develop new constitutional machinery for this. Labour, of course, is very suspicious of coalitions. I mean, it's been said the most powerful member in the Labour Party is the ghost of Ramsay MacDonald, and Labour is very suspicious of coalitions in peacetime. For that reason, the supposed betrayal of 1931. And as far as I'm aware, there's no machinery in the Labour Party by which this decision would be made.
Yeah. Please pass it back. Yes.
You haven't mentioned Northern Ireland at all.
Yeah.
Does that have any relevance at all?
Yes, I should have done.
Actually, it's interesting that the Democratic Unionist Party has opened a shop window, really, hasn't it, with its goods for anybody.
Yes, I mean, Northern Ireland is
buy.
interesting because the parties there, unlike the other small parties in the United Kingdom, are not frightened of a second election because most of the seats of the Nationalists and Unionists are fairly safe, so there's not going to be too much competition. Now, the three Sinn Féin MPs, if they return, have said they won't take those seats again, so that has the effect of lowering the bar from 325 to 323. The 8 DUP Democratic Unionists, who are the largest party, are not, as is often thought, necessarily allied to the Conservatives. They're less sectarian than they were, and their main concern is economics. And Kenneth Clarke said you can always do a deal with an Ulsterman, and what they will want is more public spending in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has suffered from austerity very considerably, very heavily dependent on public spending. And you might have thought that would ally them with the Labour Party more than the Conservatives, but they'll be up for grabs, and they have 8 seats at the present time, probably will have that afterwards. There is a problem with that, though. I think the Irish government is very worried about that because Britain is, with the Irish Republic, a co-guarantor of the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. Now, is that position compatible with having the DUP as part of a Westminster government or supporting a Westminster government? The Belfast Agreement is a very delicate settlement, and, you know, if you touch it, it's like House of Cards, could collapse. So I think the Irish government is very worried about that possibility. But it could happen. You're right, the 8 DUP members would have a weight, and they're not, I think, allied as they used to be to, well, the Unionists used to be to the Conservatives. They're up for grabs to get more money for Northern Ireland. They were bought off by Callaghan in the late 70s in a hung parliament. And his government was ruined by one Republican from Fermanagh and Tyrone, an independent Republican who owned a pub in Fermanagh and Tyrone and very rarely came to Westminster. But after a great deal of cajolery by the whips, he did decide to come, Frank Maguire. He came to Westminster to abstain in person. And but the Labour Party had hoped he would... the Labour government lost that vote by 1, the vote of confidence, but he came personally to abstain.
Actually, there's a very good play at the National Theatre. I mean, I'm not sure it's available online or any other way, called This House, which perfectly captured the chaotic nature of the latter days of the Callaghan government and gives you a sense of what life might be like in a minority government. There's a question at the back there.
Cyril Smith was offered a peerage at that time, but his mother declined it on his behalf, apparently. But it does show the lengths to which people will go.
Topical. Yep. Question at the back here.
On the subject of the Labour Party, do you think that the Labour Party would have a better chance of gaining the majority without Ed Miliband?
Well, difficult question to answer. I think political scientists in general would take the view that leadership matters much less than is thought. And Anthony King has edited a book on this very subject. And leaders of the opposition are generally behind prime ministers in personal ratings. For instance, Margaret Thatcher was, very surprisingly, in the late 1970s. Now, Ed Miliband's successes have been not noticed and might not have been achieved by anyone else. For example, when Labour's been in opposition in the past, it's usually split between left and right. And that hasn't happened with Ed Miliband because he was one of the few acolytes of Gordon Brown who got on with the acolytes of Tony Blair. And you may say if David Miliband had been leader, perhaps he'd have been better on television, but he might have alienated the acolytes of Gordon Brown. We just don't know. And Miliband was also, although said to be a tool of the unions and was elected by union votes, he's weakened the role of the unions in leadership elections by introducing a one-member, one-vote system. So I think one just doesn't know. I mean, I think it's the case that if Labour loses the election, Ed Miliband will be blamed. And as I may have said, I think two of the leaders will have gone by the end of the year. I think the backbenchers have guns in their desk drawers to shoot their leaders of two of the three major parties. But I think all the question about, I think the audience divided between on a gender basis, but I think all the questions have been from men. Shall we say that all future questions must be from women?
Well spotted, then. Any? Good for you. Wonderful. Let's bring a microphone down here.
I know that you and numerous other political commentators have said that it is impossible to predict the outcome of this general election, but I think that you're probably in the best position to hazard a guess, and I just wonder whether in your heart of hearts you might be able to...
No, I share the view that it's an impossible election to predict, but I'm not wholly confident of that prediction. Honestly, I think anyone who predicts is either a fool or a mathematical social scientist. They may be the same, but I think one can't predict. I mean, I think all the models they don't work. It's an unprecedented situation. This is the trouble, incidentally, with models of elections. They work for 2 or 3 and then collapse. There was in the early post-war years there was a model by 2 political scientists called Goodhart and Bansali that related the number of seats you won inversely to the level of unemployment. And that worked for a few elections, but it broke down in 1983 when it would have given Margaret Thatcher a negative number of seats in Parliament. It just broke down. And I just don't think there's any basis for it. Anything could happen. I mean, the UKIP vote could soar or sink. The Conservative vote could soar or sink. The Labour vote could soar or sink. The Liberal Democrat... I mean, the SNP vote could collapse. I mean, the fact that it's very high now doesn't mean necessarily high in 50 days' time. I just don't think one can predict, and I mean, I haven't the faintest idea.
Yes, have another one. Go on, absolutely, go on.
Yes, well, you said that 2 of the 3 main political leaders will go. Would you like to explain the circumstances?
Well, I'd have thought, and again, these predictions are hazardous, I'd have thought it's unlikely that Nick Clegg would be leader of the Liberal Democrats at the end of the year, or would want to be. And I'd have thought one of the leaders of the major parties will go. I'd have thought if Cameron loses, I think the backbenchers, there's a lot of backbench antagonism to him, and despite the comment made about the coalition, you see, I think a lot of backbenchers thought they wouldn't get red boxes because of the coalition, that people who'd been promised office or hoped for office wouldn't get it. And I think if Labour loses, I think Ed Miliband won't be there to fight a second election. And it seemed in both of the major parties, that, well, and the Liberal Democrats, that people are already beginning to mount leadership campaigns. I think one remarkable feature of this election is that the backbenchers of all 3 parties think they're going to lose. I mean, you talk to all of them, and none of them think they can win. But who knows?
Okay, we're right. We're coming to the end, I think. I just want to have one... I'm going to bring this back to... I have one further, if you make it very short, and then we'll get to it.
One of the consequences of the Fixed Term Parliament Act is that general elections are now always held in May on the same date as local elections. You wouldn't know it that there are local elections in May. It's completely overshadowed. Do you think we ought to change the timetable to separate?
Yeah, I mean,
they're contested in their own right.
I'm dead against the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which I think should be repealed immediately.
But even if it isn't?
Well, if it isn't, yes. Well, the only advantage of it is you get a higher turnout in local elections than otherwise would. I think our turnout is at lowest in Western Europe. Our turnout in local elections.
Well, it's always been. It's not got worse, actually.
No, but it's always been low. Everybody here talks
not
about how much they love communities and decentralisation, but when they get the chance to vote for it, they don't.
Well, I was going to say, in fairness, far from it, must have an argument about this during a lecture. No, but I think if you look at the amount of tax power in the hands of national and local government, you could see how they might vote more in national and local elections, given 95% of all the taxes.
The turnout has never been high in local elections here.
It hasn't.
Always, but you know, people say how much they love communities. They think Westminster has too much power. They want decentralisation, devolution. But they don't vote for it. Just as people, I hate to say this, but people talk a lot about more participation and so on. But when they get the chance to do it, turnout gets.
But do you think the election date should be separated?
Oh well, I'm in 2 minds because I think it does boost local election turnout. Honestly, sorry.
for all reason, people are turning out for a general election, they have to find they've got another ballot paper, so they fill it in.
Well, I think...
They've been voting in the local election.
Yes, I think that you'll know this better than I, but the majority of people who vote in local elections vote on national ground. They're not voting because they think Councillor X has been a good local councillor, but because they're Labour or Conservative or Lib Dem, and that's what the candidate is. So, I mean, we can agree on this, surely, Tony, that local government does need a radical and revolutionary overhaul if we're going to decentralise power to it.
Yes, and watch the LSE's blog. We will be having, I hope, a post on the local elections soon, just to show they do matter. Can I just finish this evening? One question implied by what you were saying earlier, which is that, I mean, the Conservative Party is one of the oldest political parties in the world, one of the oldest. And the Labour Party, well over 100 years old in many forms, and the Liberals, precursors of the Liberal Democrats, also ancient by global standard, world standards. Do you think they can, given what's happening to the three of them over time, do you think they can all survive in their current form for another 100 years, or another 20 or 30 years, or are they just out of time? Is one or more of them now out of time?
Well, that's an excellent question, and like all excellent questions, unanswerable. I mean, it partly depends on skillful political leadership. And people thought for some years that Labour was unelectable, and Tony Blair, with very skillful leadership, managed to weave things together. I just think it depends. I mean, what we're certainly seeing is that in areas which were previously one-party states, where Conservatives were completely safe, and areas where Labour was completely safe, there's now a competition from newcomers, UKIP with the Conservatives and the SNP with Labour in Scotland. And obviously, these are serious questions. I think there's no answer to them. The system's in flux, and the interesting questions can't be answered.
Good. Great place to end. OK, once more, I'd like to thank Professor Vernon Bogdanor for an excellent lecture and also for answering all our questions. Thank you very much. And, actually, for LSE, I'm sorry to sort of separate out here, but for LSE students, we are going to hold an election event on the 27th of April. So we'll make sure you know about that. But that's going to be for LSE students alone, I fear, to the rest of you. So I hope you can all come to that, those of you from the school. Thanks.